Hey guys, Aniki here. Just a quick disclaimer for those of you who've watched most of my early videos. Today's video is a sort of compilation, or remaster, if you will, of some of those videos. My goal was to basically compile the most important information and combine it all into one easy-to-watch experience with better editing and a few corrections and script improvements here and there. So if you've never seen my early videos, this right here is basically the best way to enjoy them all in one go. But if you've seen them all already and still want to keep watching, then who am I to judge? I hope you enjoy it either way. Now, let's get started. Japan, 1604. After a civil war that lasted for more than a century, legendary Shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu did the impossible by uniting a country that seemed like it will be stuck in conflict for eternity. This unification was supposed to bring with it a new age of peace for the approximately 20 million people that lived on the country's countless islands at the time. A goal which was, for the most part, achieved successfully. This peace, however, brought unemployment to nearly 500,000 soldiers whose livelihood depended on their country's seemingly endless hunger for war and conflict. These soldiers were, of course, called samurai. With their beloved homeland at peace, they had to find different ways of bringing food to the table, some of them becoming merchants, bureaucrats, or even scholars. But not all of these battle-hardened warriors were ready to accept a peaceful life off the battlefield, which led them to pursue a lifestyle that more closely resembled their behavior pre-unification. Robbing, stealing, and murdering became their new livelihood, which in the public's eye turned them from strong, respected warriors into dreadful enemies of the people. What these ex-samurai did not know at the time was that through their actions, they would create an opposition group that was destined to become the precursor of modern Japan's highly influential crime syndicates. These syndicates would become so influential, in fact, they would go on to become deeply involved in their nation's politics, accumulate immeasurable fortunes, and even plunge their own country into World War II. From the Edo period into the modern day, this is the entire history of the YAKUZA. When you think of modern-day YAKUZA members, you think of expensive suits, gold chains, and of course those highly elaborate tattoos covering their bodies. Therefore, it is interesting to note that even more than 400 years ago, some of these flashy fashion choices existed within a group closely related to the Japanese mafia's history. The aforementioned unemployed samurai, also known as ronin, started to form groups which carried the name Hatamoto Yako, meaning bannerman. Alternatively, the name kabukimono, roughly translated as crazy ones, became more and more common. So what exactly earned them this nickname? These unemployed samurai truly lived their new outlaw lifestyle, carrying extraordinarily long swords and wearing colorful clothing. Back then, bright colors and patterns were not a popular choice, especially among samurai, as it was considered to be immodest. But if you think that a colorful samurai is truly ahead of his time, you'll be even more impressed to hear that they were occasionally spotted wearing women's clothing as well. A regular old kimono isn't that far off from a women's dress anyway, I guess. But besides outlandish fashion choices, use of violence and intimidation is another characteristic that the YAKUZA is often connected with. The kabukimono, or crazy ones, were certainly not lacking in this department either. To give you an idea of how unhinged some of these ronin were, let me tell you about a disgusting practice called tsuchigiri, or crossroads killing. Sometimes, random pedestrians on the road could literally lose their head if they were unlucky enough to pass by a kabukimono. Asking the perpetrator, they would tell you it was only done in order to test the sharpness of their blade. I don't know about you, but I call bullshit on that one. Hearing about something as cruel as Tsuchigiri makes the formation of certain resistance groups all the more relatable. Theft and pretty much all other forms of crime were also included on the list of harmful activities that the Kabukimono took part in, and following such a long period of civil war, common citizens of Japan were especially tired of all the violence. After all, they were supposed to enjoy an age of peace. Enter the Machiyako, the servants of the town. These groups, who aimed to protect the common folk against the crazy ones, were mainly composed of peasants, farmers, and merchants. In some rare cases, even ex-samurai who were embarrassed by their former colleagues' behavior joined the good fight, bringing something very valuable into combat: swords. With a few exceptions, most social classes in 17th century Japan were not allowed to carry a sword. Merchants, for example, were pretty lucky to be allowed a short sword, similar to the ones that the samurai themselves liked to carry next to their big katana swords. Other classes, however, were restricted to using farming tools to defend themselves, which could certainly knock a guy out. But if you find yourself up against one of those masterfully crafted katana that samurai had at their disposal, the effectiveness of a simple stone axe diminishes quite a bit. The Machiyako were obviously true crowd favorites, earning a reputation among Japanese citizens as protectors of the people. Funnily enough, if you ask a modern Yakuza to which group their roots trace back to, they will proudly proclaim to be descendants of the Machiyako, not the Kabukimono. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, with Yakuza clearly showcasing characteristics of both the unhinged, violent Kabukimono, as well as the chivalrous servants of the common man, the Machiyako. A clear-cut connection to either of these groups cannot be made though, as both were eradicated by the government towards the end of the 17th century. While legends and folktales about the competing Yaku groups, which were now both defunct, would keep spreading across Japan well into the 18th century, the country would soon see the birth of two new groups, which would ultimately transform into the modern Japanese crime syndicates that we all know today. These two groups emerged in the mid-18th century and were called tekiya, or peddlers, and bakuto, or gamblers. Here, the connection to today's Japanese mafia starts to become a lot clearer. Even 3 centuries later, with the Yakuza having its hand in many different types of businesses like drugs and prostitution, both market stands as well as gambling are still integral parts of the crime syndicate's money-making machine. Just how huge the influence of gambling on the Yakuza really was becomes apparent by simply looking at the origin of their name. In Japan, Hanafuda cards became all the rage starting in the 16th century, and naturally, a lot of different ways to play with them emerged. One of them actually being pretty similar to blackjack. You get 3 cards, then the values of the player's cards are added up, with the total's last digit deciding who wins. A variation of the worst possible hand in the game is 8 plus 9 plus 3, which equals 20, meaning your hand is 0. In Japanese, 8, 9, 3 can be read as YAKUZA. YAKUZA. Gambling groups actually started using this word themselves in order to describe something as useless. And over time, the term started to see widespread use when describing any kind of criminal, since social outcasts and gangsters were generally considered to be useless. The similarities between a Yakuza and the Tekiya and Bakuto groups are not limited to ways of making money though. Both of them mastered something that the Yaku groups severely lacked: a high degree of organization, with rivaling gamblers and peddlers sticking to a designated area controlled by their group. You can imagine that a lack of annoying distractions like fights and other conflicts improved business quite a bit for everyone involved. Yet another similarity to the current Japanese mafia are the backgrounds of both Tekiya and Bakuto group members. Penniless, homeless, lawless, all of those who didn't find a place in Japan's highly structured, hierarchical culture found a place in these groups, making recruitment a walk in the park. Speaking of recruitment and hierarchy, who exactly was it that gave these misfits a home and a family to call their own? The use of the word family was not mere hyperbole on my part. Instead, it is the most accurate way of describing the hierarchy and relationships that Yakuza gangs have followed for the past 250 plus years, which is referred to as oyabun, kobun. Oyabun and kobun can be translated as father role and child role. When recruiting a new member, the boss, or oyabun, takes the father role, providing those of a lower rank, the kobun, with work, protection, as well as advice. The ceremony, also known as the Sakazuki ceremony, sees the Oyabun and the Kobun drinking sake together to make the whole thing official. This exchanging of sake cups between two individuals is something that I'm sure many of you have seen before in movies or even video games. Oyabun-Kobun is a type of relationship that, even today, can be found everywhere in Japan, though sometimes under different names like senpai-kohai. Family, workplaces, and of course crime groups all demand a certain degree of loyalty, respect, and hierarchy in order to function properly, which is why this system proved to be a big part of what made the Yakuza so powerful, especially during the early days. Bringing together a group of delinquents can easily result in a huge mess, unless you give them something of value, something to lose, something they did not have before, a sense of belonging and a family that is ready to fight and die for each other. Without such a meticulous structure in place, it is doubtful that the Yakuza would have survived for as long as they did. Fast forward a full century, and the Yakuza's precursors had proven that they were here to stay. The mid-1800s had arrived, bringing with them a vast amount of cultural and political changes for the country of Japan as a whole. 220 years earlier, in 1633, a foreign policy called sakoku had been installed by the shogunate government led by Tokugawa Ieyasu. With this policy in place, travel from and to Japan was basically illegal, and even trade was incredibly limited. Sakoku was put in place mainly because foreign influences and religions were viewed as a big threat to national safety and stability. After all, Christianity, brought in by the Portuguese, started gaining popularity pretty quickly at the time. In the early 19th century, the rules around the isolation policy slowly started to loosen up a little bit though, and with more and more foreign knowledge and trade making its way into Japan, the writing was on the wall, and when the US confidently sailed into Yokohama Bay in 1853 and basically told Japan to open up its doors already, it was clear that sakoku was soon about to meet its demise. And so it did. With foreign visitors and influences now allowed in the country, Japan was about to become a global superpower, freed from its chains of feudalism and led by Emperor Meiji, who initiated the Meiji Restoration, a cultural and industrial revolution which also equipped the land of the rising sun with a military, political parties, and a parliament. With the country rapidly changing and adapting, the Yakuza's precursors were forced to do the same. On one hand, this was done by diversifying business. Gambling was still the moneymaker for these gangs, and street market business was also here to stay. However, construction work and Japan's countless docks, which were now busier than ever, were both added to the catalog of revenue sources. The Yakuza were looking into legitimate business as a cover for their not-so-legitimate businesses. And with this newly found legitimacy came political connections, which in turn led to the gang's growing fond of a little thing called bribery. Shoving money down the throats of both police as well as government officials unavoidably brings with it close ties and relationships with these influential members of society, and the Yakuza understood very early on that cooperating with them would be the key to long-term success and growth. After all, if your main source of income are illegal businesses, you don't want the authorities sniffing around too much. So what the Yakuza needed was something to give them in exchange for freedom in their own endeavors. Luckily, they had two very valuable goods on offer: manpower and a knack for physical violence, two attributes which are perfect for breaking up unrest among laborers, which the Japanese government needed in order to keep their workers in check. Just like gambling and bribery, strike-breaking became synonymous with Japanese crime syndicates and loyally followed them as a business well into the modern times. The turn of the 20th century rapidly approached the land of the rising sun, and with government ties firmly established, it was time for the Yakuza to get deeply involved in politics themselves, thanks to the influence of a man named Toyama Mitsuru, ultranationalism, and the admittedly cool-sounding Dark Ocean Society. During the Meiji Restoration, the Japanese were finally able to use all of that knowledge and work ethic that they weren't really able to profit from until then, and consequently, the whole country went through an unprecedented period of growth. Japan's population grew to an impressive 45 million people, and the country's military power and economy grew at a similar rate. For many citizens, life was good and a definite improvement over the feudal Japan of old. On the island of Kyushu, however, things weren't so fine and dandy. Kyushu, at the time a poor region used mainly for coal mining, represents one of the 5 major islands which make up Japan. The island was also home to a huge number of ex-samurai who were not exactly pleased with their country adopting a Western-style government. The samurai were, after all, supposed to be the representatives of traditional Japanese values. In the 1880s, this reluctance to the adoption of Western values in Japan led to the birth of ultranationalism, a form of nationalism that goes way beyond just regular old pride of the country you reside in. Rather, it is patriotism that is transformed into a feeling of supremacy over other races or nations. Fukuoka, the most populous city on the island of Kyushu, was a hotbed for these extreme types of nationalists. It is no surprise then that one of the most influential ultranationalists in Japanese history would also be born here. Toyama Mitsuru was born in 1855 into a family of ex-samurai. Not a lot of information exists about his early life, but he was said to have had a rough childhood, growing up in poverty and selling sweet potatoes on the streets of Fukuoka. He is also said to have been a tough teenager who knew how to defend himself and grew up idolizing samurai and the traditional Japanese values which they represented. His love for these traditional values would eventually turn political when he reached his 20s, with the young Mitsuru participating in one of the last samurai uprisings that took place in Japan, the Saga Rebellion of 1874. To get a good impression of what these uprisings looked like, you should definitely check out the 2003 movie The Last Samurai, starring Tom Cruise. God, I love that movie. Spoiler alert, the government eventually put an end to these uprisings once and for all, and Toyama was consequently put in jail for 3 years as punishment for his participation. Upon his release from prison though, he seemingly didn't lose any of his passion for the old values, joining a nationalist group called Kyoshisha, or Pride and Patriotism Society. Toyama rose through the group's ranks quickly, hiring the toughest guys that Fukuoka had to offer. By not shying away from intimidation and physical violence, his group was able to keep laborers working in the region's countless coal mines in check. And with that, Toyama and his associates impressed numerous local politicians who saw huge potential in these kinds of violent methods. While the poor people in the area started calling him the Emperor of the Slums for handing out money to them in large amounts, political figures respected him for his large following and violent tactics. With so much momentum behind him, it was the perfect time for Toyama to found his own group. And so he did just that. He was only 26 years old when he founded the Genyosha, or Dark Ocean Society, in 1981. There are so many negative things to say about this man, but you gotta admit, that's a really cool name. But as cool as it may sound, its meaning is anything but. The Dark Ocean represents the ocean which separates Japan from mainland Asia, namely China and South Korea. Toyama dreamed of his home country expanding and conquering its neighbors by any means necessary, and his ultimate goal in life was to finally steer Japan in that exact direction. But to do this, he needed the support of the people. A lot of people. And his plan was clear from the start. Ex-samurai and everyone else who was nostalgic for the quote-unquote Japan of old harbored strong feelings of hatred towards their new democratic government. Pulling these frustrated citizens into an ultranationalist group which fights for the traditional values that they missed so much was a simple task in most cases, and Toyama knew exactly how to use this vulnerability to his advantage. Officially, the code of the Dark Ocean Society was actually quite vague. Revere the Emperor, love your nation, defend the rights of the people. However, Toyama's true intentions were of violent nature, and of course, he expected members of his group to follow suit. It didn't take long for the Dark Ocean Society to establish important relations with politicians, with some members of the group even working as bodyguards for higher-ranking government officials. Some members, on the other hand, specialized in the field of persuasion, helping political figures get pretty much whatever they desired, with sheer violence, of course, being the main method of persuading their victims. But the Dark Ocean Society even had a legitimate workforce at their disposal, including plumbers and carpenters. And not only did they infiltrate seemingly every aspect of everyday life in their area, they also had their own ultranationalist schools, which taught foreign languages and martial arts, shaping the next generation of ultranationalists. Not only that, but even spy techniques were on the Dark Ocean Society curriculum, and spies educated at these exact schools would eventually form large parts of the Japanese intelligence network, which would be crucial to the country's future endeavors. The Dark Ocean Society's influence on Japanese politics grew bigger and bigger. Intimidation of voters, as well as politicians and laborers, worked as a tool of steering the public towards their own political ideology, which was not only beneficial to their goals of pushing Japan to the far right, but it also made them a lot of money. Money which was reinvested into the planning of even more high-profile assassinations and attacks, creating a vicious cycle. Among these attacks was the stabbing of a liberal politician Itagaki Taisuke in 1981, as well as a bomb attack on future Prime Minister Okuma Shigenobu in 1889, which did cost him a leg, but fortunately not his life. All of this insane assassination practice culminated in the group's biggest plot yet, which involved the 1892 national elections. These elections would go down as the most violent of their kind in Japanese history, and are considered to be the first big collaboration between rightist groups and the Yakuza, aiming to disrupt the voting process, especially in areas with support for the Liberal Party. Toyama, worried that his already impressive numbers of manpower would not suffice, called upon the help of a gang boss from Kumamoto. 300 gangsters eventually came to support Toyama, while the Minister of Home Affairs mobilized a police force for backup. This army of rightists, gangsters, and policemen burned down politicians' properties and intimidated and attacked voters. In total, 388 people were injured and 25 lost their lives. For some people at the top, this was seemingly enough to convince them of Toyama's power. Their next big mission came only 3 years later, in 1895. It was a secret request from none other than the Minister of War, a request which asked the Dark Ocean Society to start a quote-unquote fire in Korea. On the morning of October 8, 1895, Toyama's men educated in the Dark Ocean Society's schools aided the infiltration of the Korean royal palace and the subsequent assassination of the Queen of Korea. The historical significance of this event cannot be overstated, as it ultimately opened the door for a Japanese invasion, which then led to Korea's annexation in 1910. Japan would not leave Korea until 1945. Back in Japan, ultranationalist groups started popping up seemingly everywhere, gaining notoriety among the country's citizens. For them, the Yakuza and the ultranationalists pretty much blended together into one entity, and for good reason. By now, groups like the Dark Ocean Society had adapted the same hierarchical system as the Yakuza gangs and performed the same initiation rituals as well. The Yakuza also shared a similarly negative attitude towards anything foreign and developed the same political opinions. For the Yakuza though, these political opinions were more financially motivated than ideologically, which over time actually became a pretty common theme among ultranationalists as well. Certain rules established by the new democratic government severely hurt Yakuza business and made their lives much harder. Gambling, for example, which had long been one of their main moneymakers, had to be kept even more underground than ever before. In desperate need of support, the Yakuza entered a new age of collaboration with rightist groups, and there was one group in particular which appealed to them. The Kokuryokai, newly founded in 1901 by Uchida Ryohei, a right-hand man of Toyama. This group can be considered a successor to the Dark Ocean Society, not only in ideology, but also in name. Kokuryo refers to the Amur River, which represents the boundary between Manchuria, now part of China, and Russia. A clear statement. For the ultranationalists, the invasion of Korea was not enough. Ultimate control of the whole Asian continent was the goal, and some especially fanatic supporters even longed for Haku Ichiyu, or the 8 corners of the world under one roof. A Japanese roof, that is. A name more commonly associated with the Amur River Society is Black Dragon Society, which stems from an alternative spelling of the group's name, utilizing the letters for black and dragon. Again, an incredibly cool name for an incredibly evil organization. In order to continue the success of its predecessor group, the Black Dragon Society took over both its members and policies, which would see them experience substantial growth over the next 30 years. And along the way, Toyama played an important advisory role in guiding this new group. With his help, they managed to push the Japanese government into a successful war with Russia and an eventual invasion of China. Japan, in the meantime, continued to grow and established a healthy middle class by the 1920s despite all the violence that was going on. Toyama's power grew just as quickly, and in seemingly no time, he was having dinner at the Imperial Palace, maintaining healthy relationships with powerful politicians and even the imperial family. The next step up in power for Toyama came in the year 1919, when, with the help of the Minister of Home Affairs, he did something unprecedented. He formed the nation's first federation of gangsters, the Dainippon Kokusuikai, or Great Japan National Essence Society. Doesn't quite roll off the tongue like the last two organizations' names, to be honest. The federation boasted a total of 60,000 members, among them gangsters, laborers, and of course, ultranationalists. The same principles of the Dark Ocean Society applied here as well. But in reality, they were nothing more than the world's biggest group of strikebreakers. The Kokusuikai brought a new level of violence to the table though, receiving support from the police and even some high-ranking military officials. One notable strike-breaking job carried out by the Federation was the attack on 28,000 people during the Yawata Ironworks strike in 1920. But Toyama occasionally used the manpower at his disposal against personal enemies as well, making him one of the most dangerous and powerful men in the whole country. One thing that this federation of gangsters certainly did not have to worry about was a lack of work. They were employed by the Seiyukai, one of the two dominant political parties in Japan at the time. And left with no other choice, the second dominant party, called Riken Minseto, also started hiring gangsters, most of them members of the Yakuza, and with that, the Japanese mafia had officially entered Japanese politics, with ties reaching so deep that some Yakuza leaders even made it into parliament. It took until the 1930s until the violence finally became too much, even for the seemingly unshakable people of Japan, with the country's politics destabilizing as a result. From 1930 until 1945, a total of 29 violent incidents related to politics were recorded, among them the assassinations of 2 finance ministers and 2 prime ministers. The government put the Yakuza in charge of running quote-unquote land development in Manchuria, which was occupied with the Black Dragon Society's help. In reality, their job was fostering an addiction among Chinese citizens by running an opium business, which didn't only make money for Japan, but also weakened the resistance of said Chinese citizens against the Japanese invasion. The opium business was only one of many heinous acts committed by the Japanese government in Manchuria at that time, most of them being way too violent and despicable in nature to even attempt to describe here. But back in Japan, members of the Yakuza were swimming in money. Due to the country's expansion, the nation accumulated a fortune, which the gangsters knew how to utilize for their own gain. It was around this time that the Yakuza gang started controlling many of the busiest ports across Japan, one of them located in Kobe in Japan's Kansai region. Kobe slowly but surely turned into a hotbed of Yakuza activity, and around the same time became the birthplace of what would later become the biggest crime organization that Japan has ever seen. More on that later. For Toyama, times couldn't have been much better either. His wealth and power increased exponentially, symbolized by a historic moment in 1937, when he officially introduced the new Prime Minister of Japan, Prince Konoe Fumimaro, to the Japanese public. Considering just how powerful Toyama was, it's not totally out of the question that he had actually been involved in the Prime Minister's appointment. Konoe Fumimaro was also known to share similar feelings towards foreigners as Toyama did. And it is this shared disdain for the outside world which would soon set off a chain of events that would change the course of not just Japanese, but world history. Before being appointed as Prime Minister, Konoe wrote about his travels to the US, France, and England, mentioning both the growing overseas hostility towards the people of Japan, as well as a US government policy which barred people of Asian descent from entering the country. A humiliation of the Japanese people, according to Konoe, who most likely developed the mindset of an ultranationalist and got into contact with Toyama Mitsuru around the same time. Fast forward to Konoe's rise to power in the late 1930s. He awarded one of his good friends, Koichi Kido, an important job in the government, making him the Minister of Education. Only a few years later, Koichi had become the main advisor of Emperor Hirohito. And when it came to choosing a successor to Konoe for the role of Prime Minister, a man named Tojo Hideki was the only logical choice in the eyes of Koichi. Hirohito took his advisor's recommendation to heart, and in 1941 gave Tojo Hideki the most powerful position in Japanese politics, a position which he would hold until 1944, leading to what might be the most eventful 4 years that Japan and the world had ever experienced. On December 7, 1941, not even 2 months after Tojo's appointment, Japan officially joined the stage of World War II with an attack on Pearl Harbor ordered by the new Prime Minister of Japan. This attack did not only plunge both the US and Japan into World War II, it was also the beginning of the end when it came to the relationship between the YAKUZA and ultranationalist groups. With the war keeping them more than busy, the government saw no use for a continuing partnership between the two, and the government's laser focus on waging a war on more than one front did not only take away a lot of influence and power from Yakuza gangs, it would also make them incredibly poor. With pretty much no resources at their disposal, the 300-year-old Japanese underworld basically fell apart for the first time and wouldn't recover for about a decade. Toyama Mitsuru himself died in 1944 at the age of 89. He was no politician, nor a soldier or a military leader, and yet the seed that he had planted changed the fate of his own country forever. The Dark Ocean Society, the Black Dragon Society, and all the other ultranationalist groups that followed their ideals were instrumental in steering Japan into a ruthless, warmongering mindset. Without Toyama and these groups, who knows if the necessary political pieces would have ever fallen into place. For Toyama himself, a lifetime of working towards his dreams seemed to have paid off. Before his death in 1944, Japan was still competing in the war. Almost all of Asia had been conquered, and the world would soon be united under a Japanese roof. Or at least, that's what he himself chose to believe. Toyama Mitsuru never had a chance to see the drastic changes that would occur right after his death. Japan had already been showing some cracks around that time, but not even a year later, Russia invaded Manchuria, while the US dropped the atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And with that, Japan's defeat and eventual capitulation were sealed. In the end, Toyama and his nationalist societies changed nothing, instead laying the foundation for the pain and suffering of millions of people. On September 2, 1945, the USS Missouri arrived in Tokyo Bay, adorned with the flags of the US, the Soviet Union, and China. Aboard the warship at 9 AM Tokyo time, the Foreign Minister and General of the Armed Forces of Japan signed a document which made Japan's surrender official. And after a few more signatures and a 20-minute-long ceremony, it was finally over. The most violent and costly war in the history of mankind had come to an end. 6 days later, General Douglas MacArthur arrived at the American embassy in Tokyo. The American flag was raised, and the 8th Army received the order to both occupy and administer Japan, a country which was reduced to nothing but ruins. Merely the historic capital of Kyoto, which is considered to be the cultural capital of Japan, was largely unharmed. Tokyo, the actual capital of Japan, experienced quite the opposite. Out of 1,650,000 buildings in the city, 1 million were destroyed by a series of fire raids which took place in 1945. As grim as these numbers may sound though, Tokyo, and with it Japan, was ready to rise from its ashes. American businessman Edwin Pauley, in a letter to General MacArthur, claimed, "In spite of extensive destruction, especially in the closing phases of the war, Japan retains more industrial capacity than she needs or has ever used for her civilian economy." Japan was about to be rebuilt, and the US was tasked with the job. However, while carrying out said rebuild, the occupation government would also inadvertently revive the Japanese underworld. Just like Japan, the Yakuza would soon return to their former strength, in the process growing much bigger and more influential than they had ever been. In order to rebuild the defeated nation of Japan, quite a few things had to be done first. Japan's military was to be disarmed, with all their weapons, war equipment, and factories ordered to be disposed of. Also, hundreds of war criminals had to be put to trial, a lengthy process which culminated in a sort of Far Eastern version of the Nuremberg trials, also known as the Tokyo trials. The occupation was also in charge of getting rid of secret societies, releasing political prisoners, and completely revamping Japan's school system. More important than all of these things though, at least to the Americans, was to make sure that post-war Japan would adopt a democratic constitution. The last thing that the US was looking for was to see Japan turn communist, and they were ready to do everything in their power to prevent it from happening. While working around the clock on making all of these things possible, the people of Japan were still starving. Sure, the war was over, which was a huge relief for people worldwide, including Japan. Relief, however, does not fill an empty stomach. The occupation supplied Japanese citizens with rations, which were, however, kept at a minimum. This wasn't necessarily done out of spite against the citizens of America's fierce war rivals. In truth, rations were in short supply, even for the Americans and their allies. This shortage of rations, however, brought with it some nasty negative side effects that would snowball into a way bigger problem: the black markets. Quickly and in huge numbers, these illegal trading places would offer the opportunity for the starving population to get some actual food and other items, the most popular of which was of course rice, which wasn't only a rarity at the time, but also incredibly expensive. The average daily post-war salary in Japan was estimated to be about 10 yen, which at the time was barely enough to buy one small orange. The earliest iterations of these illegal markets were not necessarily controlled by the Japanese though. Instead, the so-called Sangokujin took over Japan's early post-war market trade. Sangokujin, or third country nationals, is a derogatory term which refers to citizens of countries that some Japanese, especially back then, considered to be inferior, mainly China, Taiwan, and Korea. Citizens of these nations were brought to Japan in large numbers during and even before World War II in order to replace Japanese workers who were forced to join the war effort. To put it bluntly, the Sangokujin were treated like slaves. Out of the 2.6 million Koreans and 50,000 Chinese citizens that were brought to Japan, 2 million were sent back home after the end of World War II, while the rest stayed and tried to make a living in the newly occupied post-war Japan. The Sangokujin who decided to stay in Japan were able to dominate the early post-war black markets, mainly because the Americans, who frequented these markets themselves, simply did not trust the Japanese market stall owners and decided to buy from the Sangokujin instead. In addition to their dominance over the black markets, Japan's immigrant workers understandably had a lot of pent-up aggression towards Japanese citizens, which would unfortunately result in violent attacks on a regular basis. Meanwhile, the Japanese police weren't even able to intervene, as they were in pretty rough shape themselves. Apparently, too many ultra-nationalists and other individuals who could threaten the rebuild of Japan were employed as law enforcement before and during the war, which led to the dismantling of pretty much the entire police force during the early days of the occupation. With nobody around to keep these attacks or even the black markets under control, certain groups of Japanese citizens, fueled by a mix of both rage regarding the Sangokujin's occasional attacks on Japanese citizens, as well as a healthy dose of jealousy related to their early black market dominance, decided to take matters into their own hands. The YAKUZA were back. The port city of Kobe soon became the stage for one of the biggest confrontations between the YAKUZA and the Sangokujin. A total of 300 quote-unquote third country nationals entered a local police station and took hostages. According to Taoka Kazuo, boss of the fast-growing Yamaguchi-gumi gang from Kobe, the city's mayor, with no police around to solve the problem for him, asked the YAKUZA for help. Safe to say, the mayor probably wasn't aware of the huge debt that comes with asking the YAKUZA for a favor. The local gangs gathered all the weapons they could find and successfully fought back against the Sangokujin, not only making them feel, at least in their mind, like heroes of the people, but also hitting two birds with one stone in the process. The Sangokujin that the Yakuza despised so much were embarrassed, while the most powerful person in the city was now in their debt. Years after losing all their money and political connections due to the war, the star of the Yakuza was slowly beginning to rise again. Even in the eyes of the Japanese public, the Yakuza had started to gain some popularity, with tales like the one from Kobe spreading across Japan. One other tale in particular might, even nowadays, bring back feelings of nostalgia to the oldest generation of Japanese citizens. The Battle of Shimbashi. Shimbashi is an area in Tokyo which is about as central as it gets, being a 10-minute walk away from Ginza, now famous as one of Tokyo's largest shopping districts. Obviously, a very influential area to control, even during the 1940s. According to one tale, some Yakuza members managed to salvage a weapon from a destroyed fighter plane, set it up on the roof of an elementary school building, and used it to force Taiwanese gangs in the area to retreat. The accuracy of this story is, at best, questionable, but it certainly worked in convincing many poor and frustrated Japanese citizens that the Yakuza were some kind of saviors of the common folk, kind of like the aforementioned Machiyako. Now, the American occupation government was well aware of these violent encounters, but there is a big difference between being aware of a problem and understanding a problem. One of the rare cases where someone in the occupation government actually cared about what was really going on in Tokyo came in July of 1946. Harry Shuck, an investigator for the Public Safety Division, found out about a man named Matsuda Giichi, the founder and leader of the Matsuda-gumi gang. Matsuda was shot by one of his own members in an attempted, yet ultimately unsuccessful coup, which then led to his wife taking over the whole gang. Investigator Shuck brought her in for questioning, making her spill the beans regarding the history of the gang. This also marked the first time that the Americans found out about both the Yakuza and what was actually going on in Japan. The Matsuda-gumi was founded just a year before, in 1945. The idea to even form a gang in the first place came when Giichi and his wife noticed the meteoric rise of black markets in their area, and obviously, they wanted in on the money. The investigators were especially shocked to hear that Matsuda counted on the support from local police in setting up his black markets, which made money by charging stall owners for basic needs like cleaning and electricity, and of course licenses. Matsuda was basically without competition in Shimbashi, until the Sangokujin arrived, which resulted in a fierce rivalry between the two factions. This exact origin story, with some minor differences here and there, probably applies to almost every gang which was either newly formed or revived during Japan's post-war period. The rise of the black markets gave them an opportunity to gain a foothold and influence in their area. And with that, the Japanese criminal landscape as a whole experienced a significant resurgence, and among the hundreds, if not thousands of gangs that sprung up all across the country at the time, two bosses in particular managed to dominate the underworld for a while. Ando Akira was a man who, while his fellow countrymen were starving, managed to make millions in the destroyed and defeated country. However, his rise to immeasurable fortunes is a unique case, with Ando actually starting his rise to power during the war. He was the owner of Dayan Construction, a company tasked by none other than the Japanese government with moving around factories and establishing infrastructure in certain areas. Especially during the air raids, this was a crucial job, and a profitable one at that. Even more importantly, Ando pretty much controlled the Korean workforce of Japan. And as you may remember from earlier, the number of Korean workers in Japan had reached 2 million by the end of the war. One thing is for sure, Ando Akira was an incredibly influential figure during the war. The end of the war, however, did not spell the end of his profits, as was often the case. Quite the opposite, in fact. He was now employed by the Americans instead, with his work starting even before the occupation government set up shop in Tokyo. Atsugi Air Base, where General MacArthur landed before taking office as the occupation leader, was actually prettied up and prepared by Ando Akira and Dayan Construction. Speaking of which, his company was actually more of a mix between a construction company and a gang, and the way that Ando Akira ran his company would in many ways become the blueprint for the Yakuza gangs that followed. Combining construction and organized crime is a model that has worked wonders for many Japanese gang bosses over the past few decades, and well into present times. Ando's reach extended behind the scenes of the political world as well. He owned a few nightclubs that some of the American big dogs would frequent, which was of particular interest to every politician in Japan who wanted both democracy and the existence of an emperor to stay in place. To the Americans, Ando appealed just as much, if not even more, by proudly proclaiming that he will fight communism as long as he lives. A phrase that will bring a joyful tear to the eye of every post-war American. Despite all this power, influence, and money, Ando actually preferred to stay out of the public eye though. Ozo Kinosuke, on the other hand, was the complete opposite, at least in this regard. In an October 1947 issue of the Saturday Evening Post, Daryl Kerrigan described Ozu as Tokyo's own Al Capone. How did this guy become famous enough to make it into an American magazine? Ozu was a pretty ordinary gangster like any other during the war. His rise to fame, however, takes us back to Shimbashi and the death of Matsuda Giichi. Following Matsuda's death, Ozu was quick to react and snatched the opportunity to take over the Shinbashi area. But he wouldn't stop there. He also took control of both the gambling business and the local gangs in Tokyo's Shinjuku area. Shinjuku, now the home of a bustling nightlife scene, got its start as one of the capital's biggest entertainment hubs around this exact time, when Ozu Kinosuke was in control of the area. With control over not one, but two of the most important areas in all of Tokyo, Ozu was big enough to receive a place in the Chamber of Commerce. Fueled by his newly found confidence and influence, he even ran for a seat in parliament, and even though he lost to a communist opponent, he received an impressive 12,000 votes. One thing was clear, the Yakuza were not only back to making loads of money, their influence on Japanese politics was also about to make a big comeback. While all of this was going on, the occupation forces didn't only ignore the rise of the Yakuza, they actively supported them, with GIs being some of the main suppliers of the black markets which made the gangs so much money in the first place. To put into perspective how much power and control we were talking about here, some numbers might be necessary. In total, 48,000 market stalls were estimated to exist in Tokyo alone. Out of these 48,000 stalls, 88% were controlled by the Tekiya, or Yakuza-related peddlers. There was even a union for street stall tradesmen, called Roten Dogyo Kumiai, which also boasted some incredible numbers. 200 bosses controlling 4,000 members and 22,000 lower members. At the top of it all, Tokyo's own Al Capone, Ozu Kinosuke. The numbers regarding Yakuza groups immediately following the war were equally impressive, with Tokyo being a hotspot of gang activity. 181 oyabun, or bosses, had control over 7,400 kobun, or lower-class gangsters. Similar numbers were also estimated to be present in the city of Kobe. Stunning numbers. Surely, the report containing this and much more important information would be of interest to General MacArthur and his occupation government. Well, apparently not. The monthly reports never even made it to the general's desk. Except for a few people inside the occupation, nobody seemed to show any interest whatsoever in stopping the rise of the criminal underworld in Japan. This may seem baffling, considering that their job was to, rebuild Japan, and the thriving underworld sure doesn't sound like it would help such an endeavor. Even more so when you consider that a lot of the biggest Yakuza groups had strong links to ultra-nationalists, which, as we explored earlier, were in large part responsible for Japan's entry into the war, which cost the US so dearly. So why accept the existence of not only the Yakuza, but also the ultra-nationalists? In order to understand this, we must also understand that the US certainly didn't take the job of rebuilding Japan out of sheer kindness. There was a lot at stake for the Americans. Simply put, their ultimate goal during the occupation was preventing Japan from turning communist. The ultranationalists, who aligned themselves with the complete opposite side of the political spectrum, were a potentially powerful ally in the American war against communism in Japan. Soon, the Americans did way more than merely ignoring the Yakuza. When the JCP, or Japanese Communist Party, increased its membership from 8,000 to 100,000 in just 3 years, the occupation seemingly panicked. A lot of their efforts to stop the JCP were done very publicly, including raids of radio stations or newspaper agencies, and ordering universities to let go of professors that aligned themselves with communism in any way, shape, or form. In total, around 20,000 workers lost their jobs during this purge. But the dirty work, which had to be kept under covers, was outsourced to Yakuza gangs. One such job came in 1947, when Chinese citizens in Yokohama harassed the Japanese. Instead of taking care of it themselves, the Americans hired an up-and-coming gang to take care of the problem. Korean gang boss Machi Hisayuki was in the process of forming a new gang consisting mainly of so-called Sainichi Koreans, a gang that would later become infamous under the name Tozeikai. Despite commanding one of the newer gangs in Tokyo when they were hired by the Americans, Machi Hisayuki's sheer manpower and connections were enough to easily take care of his employer's problems. It was a sign of what was to come, because Machi's rise to the top was fast and seemingly unstoppable. Soon after working for the American occupation, Machi Hisayuki and the fast-growing Tozeikai were able to drive their biggest enemy, the Sumiyoshi-kai, out of the equally fast-growing Ginza district. Machi's grip on that area was actually so firm that he himself received the name Ginza no Tora, or Ginza Tiger, while the Tosekai itself became known as the Ginza Police, quite literally outnumbering the police presence in the area. By aligning himself with powerful politicians, power brokers, and gangsters, both in Japan and in Korea, Machi Hisayuki became not only one of the most respected, but also one of the richest individuals in the Yakuza's centuries-long history. According to one of his many business partners, Machi might have been worth well over $1 billion. For proof, look no further than this 7-story entertainment complex in the heart of Tokyo's Roppongi district, which once included clubs, discos, restaurants, sauna baths, and everything else that the heart desired back in the 1970s. All that and much more, including an American oil business, belonged to Machi Hisayuki, who even resided inside this massive building known as the TSK CCC until his death in 2002, long after the building stopped serving its intended purpose and 6 years before it was finally demolished. But for now, let's go back to the early days of post-war Yakuza history, to September of 1951, when the San Francisco Peace Treaty was signed. After an eventful 7-year period, the American occupation of Japan was officially over, and Japan was finally independent once again, and a constitution, the creation of which was overseen by General MacArthur, was put into place in 1947. Fun fact, Japan is actually the only country in the world which had its constitution written by another country, a constitution which is also the oldest unamended constitution in the world. It has actually remained unchanged from its original 1947 version to this day. Not for a lack of trying, though. The 50s were a time of rapid change for the country of Japan. More and more Japanese women started applying for jobs and finally got the right to vote, and the elections were held on a regular basis, as is usual for a modern democratic state like Japan had now become. Japan was still Japan, though. In many ways, it has been westernized, but in just as many ways, it has stayed true to its roots and traditions. This balance between looking toward the future while not forgetting one's own roots is something that is still a fitting description for the Japan of today, if you ask me. And in many ways, the foundation for that was laid during the occupation years. On the surface, Japan seemed to have headed full steam in the right direction. But the country's criminal underworld was about to experience the same meteoric rise as Japan's economy would, with one man in particular playing a huge role in making this rise to the top a reality. Born in Fukushima, Japan in 1911, Kodama Yoshio had a rough time growing up. At the young age of 8, he was sent to Korea to stay with distant relatives, which was not the beginning of a heartwarming family story. Instead, Kodama was forced into industrial labor as a young child where for the first time, he witnessed just how badly workers could be exploited. This traumatizing experience became especially relevant later on when, during his teenage years back in Japan, he became active as a socialist before joining multiple ultra-nationalist groups in the late 1920s. Kodama, with his affinity for violence and his organizational talent, fit right into these groups, one of which was none other than the aforementioned Black Dragon Society. In 1929, Kodama was arrested for the first, but not the last time. He attempted to hand Hirohito a handwritten letter, asking the emperor to develop an increased sense of patriotism. He got a bit closer to achieving this than the police would have liked, which saw him receive a 6-month prison sentence. Upon his release, Kodama founded his own ultranationalist group, the Dokuritsu Seinensha, or Independence Youth Society. But after a failed attempt to assassinate the Prime Minister of Japan at the time, Admiral Saito, Kodama spent yet another 3.5 years in prison. Seems like a pretty light sentence for an assassination attempt of this caliber. Upon his release in 1937, he wasted no time and got right back to work, making good use of his former ultranationalist connections, which provided Kodama with a position inside Japan's Foreign Ministry Information Bureau, where he caught the attention of people at the very top. And so, Kodama became a spy for the Japanese government, setting up a network of agents which infiltrated China and collected information for Japan's war efforts. Then, in December of 1941, only a day after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, Kodama celebrated the creation of his own agency, the Kodama Kikan, its headquarters located in the city of Shanghai. The Kodama Kikan supplied the Japanese Navy with important goods needed for the war, like various weapons, copper, nickel, etc. Kodama basically strong-armed Chinese traders into accepting his ridiculously low offers for these items before reselling them to the Japanese for a much higher price, earning Kodama an absolute fortune. His company, it is said, had around $175 million at its disposal at one point. According to Kodama himself, though, he never really cared about the financial side of things. What a great guy, am I right? While basically robbing Chinese traders and making loads of cash, Kodama did not forget about his roots in the spy business. By setting up shop in China, he was at the source of a lot of valuable political and strategic information, which he readily shared with the Japanese army. He also funded the construction of a Shanghai office for the Kempeitai, the secret police of Japan, whose goal was, simply put, to arrest everyone that they considered to be quote-unquote anti-Japanese. By the time that Japan surrendered to the Allied forces in 1945, Kodama had not only become incredibly rich, he also had a hand in making sure that the surrender to the Americans would go over peacefully. Very early on, he realized that sucking up to his new occupiers would be important if he wanted to hold on to his influence and power gained during the war. The Americans, though, didn't take the bait, imprisoned Kodama anyway, and set up a lengthy interrogation regarding his work in China. According to an internal report from 1947, the American occupation forces considered Kodama to be a very dangerous man. They feared him not only because of his background as an ultranationalist, but also because of his immense wealth. And yet, Kodama was never charged with anything, and was subsequently released from Sugamo prison in 1948, after a mere 3 years of imprisonment. A deal struck between Kodama and the Americans was very likely the cause for this decision. After all, the man had important insider information that the Americans needed badly, regarding both China as well as prominent communist supporters in Japan. Kodama did not waste a minute of his jail time, already planning his next step following his eventual release. In fact, even before going to jail, he was prepared, entrusting a majority of his wealth to a fellow rightist, Tsuchi Karoku, the mystery man of Japanese politics, as the occupation liked to call him. With seemingly no money in the bank, Tsuchi was able to put a vast amount of funds towards the creation of the Liberal Party, which, trust me, will become a very important part of this story. The money, of course, was that of Kodama himself, who planned this investment years in advance. Following his release from Sugamo prison, Kodama also got involved with YAKUZA for the first, but certainly not the last time, employing the help of the Meirakigumi gang to orchestrate an attack on the Union of Hokutan coal mine, a thorn in the eye of both American and Japanese politicians. The attack was ultimately unsuccessful, but Kodama was able to keep up a healthy relationship with both the YAKUZA and politicians regardless, a relationship that benefited everyone involved. The government appreciated having manpower and intimidation tactics available at all times, and the YAKUZA would make loads of cash for providing just that. All they needed was a middleman, a bridge between the government and organized crime, someone who understood both sides. Kodama was their guy. And just like that, the groundwork for Kodama's rise to the top was laid. A couple of years later, in 1955, the Liberal Party, funded largely by Kodama's money, merged with the Democratic Party, creating the Liberal Democratic Party, or LDP. According to declassified CIA documents and a New York Times article from 1994, the CIA funneled millions of dollars into the LDP from the very beginning. Ex-CIA agent Alfred C. Ulmer Jr., who ran the CIA in the Far East from 1955 until 1958, stated, quote, "We financed them. We depended on the LDP for information." The CIA did not only pump money into the newly merged Conservative Party, they also hired informers from within the party. With the financial support of the US and the leadership qualities of Kodama, the LDP would go on to dominate Japanese politics for decades to come. In fact, as of the making of this video, the LDP is still the ruling party in Japan. Back in 1955, though, 3 men inside the LDP prepared to control Japan from behind the scenes. Kishi Nobusuke, Sasakawa Ryoichi, and of course, Kodama Yoshio. Kodama, as we've already established, started pulling the strings behind the scenes of Japanese politics while he was in Sugamo prison, and only a decade later, he became the mastermind behind the appointment of Prime Minister Hatoyama Ichiro, the first LDP member to take Japan's highest office. By the mid-1950s, Kodama controlled more than just politics, though. He also had his own real estate firm, multiple gambling newspapers, and was also interested in the acquisition of film companies, baseball teams, and a shipping line. Some nightclubs in Tokyo's Ginza district were also under his control, and led him into a close partnership with the aforementioned Yakuza boss, Machi Hisayuki of the Toseikai gang. In the meantime, he still received paychecks from the CIA on a regular basis and was still in the lucrative business of strike-breaking, which in return further deepened his ties with the Yakuza. Politicians, spies, gangsters, rightists, you name it. Everyone who had any kind of power or influence in Japan was now a friend of Kodama. Sasakawa Ryoichi, a man who had long been admired by Kodama Yoshio, was himself a self-proclaimed admirer of both Italian fascist leader Benito Mussolini and the limelight. This guy loved plastering his face all over commercials, magazines, and the likes. And according to Sasakawa himself, he was not a rightist, but a humanitarian, despite being quoted by Time magazine as calling himself the world's wealthiest fascist. Sasakawa met Kodama in Sugamo prison, where they shared a cell together for a while, and just like his cellmate, he planned ahead while serving his time in jail, planning to one day make it big in the gambling business. Upon his release from Sugamo, he contacted multiple local governments about potential opportunities in the gambling business. The local governments welcomed the additional source of income and allowed Sasakawa to found the Japan Motorboat Racing Association. Motorboat racing, by the way, is actually one of only 4 sports that allow betting in Japan. Sports that are also known as koe kyogi, or public sports. Sasakawa's company grew quickly, and by 1980 grossed a total of $7.4 billion. Safe to say, Sasakawa wasn't gonna starve anytime soon. Sasakawa and Kodama in combination were so powerful, they could pretty much choose who became minister in Japan. In fact, they would eventually end up appointing a prime minister of their choice. Kishi Nobusuke was a fascist just like Sasakawa, and one of the most powerful men in Manchuria, following Japan's brutal and inhumane conquests. And it was also here that he would meet multiple Yakuza members and ultra-nationalists who were active in Manchuria, keeping themselves busy mostly by spreading a drug habit among Manchurian citizens. Upon his return to Japan, Kishi Nobusuke became the Minister of Trade and Industry, as well as the Munitions Minister under Tojo Hideki, the man who ordered the attack on Pearl Harbor. Kishi then re-entered politics in 1952, only 4 years after serving a 3-year prison sentence in Sugamo prison, and became a high-ranking member of the LDP by teaming up with his old jail buddies Kodama and Sasakawa, who managed to get Kishi elected as the Prime Minister of Japan in 1957, a mere 9 years after he was released from jail. A true world record speedrun of Japanese politics. Kishi, with his newly found influence, brought a slew of powerful Yakuza-related people into politics, among them Ono Bamboku. Ono, now a high-ranking LDP member, had an undeniably close relationship to the gangs. When Hirata Katsuichi became the new godfather of the Honda Kai, a subgroup of the Yamaguchi-gumi gang, Ono held a speech for more than 2,000 people, where he proudly declared that Yakuza and politicians followed the same chivalrous goals, even if they had different occupations. With a steady grip on the most powerful people in Japan, the LDP was ready to dominate Japanese politics for the next few decades, and the Yakuza was always there to assist them along the way. When in 1960, the US attempted to change the security pact between them and the Japanese government, a leftist group known as AMPO, which consisted mainly of students, started protesting in large numbers on the streets of Tokyo. The new far-right government, which had put all of its weight behind a new treaty agreeing to the Americans' request, wasted no time in hiring an army consisting of ultra-nationalists and Yakuza to silence the protests. Kishi Nobusuke wanted this treaty to go through, no matter what. The first big scuffle came on May 19, 1960, when the LDP physically blocked protesters from the cabinet building while discussing the final details of the new treaty. They wanted the whole thing to be finished by June, symbolized by a visit of US President Eisenhower, who was supposed to share an open motorcade with Emperor Hirohito on June 21st. The Japanese government, though, was afraid of the protesters creating a disaster during the president's visit and planned for 18,000 policemen to be present, all while only 15,000 were actually available in Tokyo. Kishi, who was not confident in the Tokyo police and its numbers, entrusted Kodama with taking care of the noisy protesters. And what better way to deal with such a problem than hiring an army of Yakuza to do the job? The Kinzei-kai gang, the Sumiyoshi-kai gang, and Ozukinosuke, Tokyo's own Al Capone, all joined Kodama's anti-protest army, which, according to Nakamura Koji of the Far Eastern Economic Review, consisted of a total of 18,000 Yakuza members, 10,000 street vendors, 10,000 rightists, multiple helicopters, and a budget of $2.3 million. Numbers fit for taking down a small country, let alone protecting two politicians. All of that money and meticulous planning went completely down the drain, however, when the visit of Eisenhower was cancelled. The Japanese simply considered the whole thing to be way too risky, especially after the protests reached a new level of tension with a fight between hired rightists and the Anpo, which left several protesters injured, one of them fatally. As a result, 300,000 people protested in the streets of Tokyo, calling for Kishi to resign. The treaty, however, was pushed through anyways and signed on June 18, 1960. Kishi Nobusuke actually resigned 5 days later in order to calm down the protests, but would ultimately stay active behind the scenes of the LDP while another party member, Ikeda Hayato, became the new prime minister. During all this, Kodama formed the so-called Seinen Shiso Kenkyukai, or Youth Ideology Study Association, a group that may have sounded harmless, but was anything but. It included members such as Sagoya Tomeo, who was involved in the 1930 assassination of Prime Minister Hamaguchi Osachi, who initially survived the attack but passed away from a bacterial infection caused by the assassination attempt 9 months later. Other members included the boss of the gigantic Sumiyoshi-kai gang, and again Kodama's BFF, Machi Hisayuki of the Tosei-kai. This personal army of Kodama would come in handy on multiple occasions, like in 1971, when author Takemori Hisamoto was about to publish a book about Kodama titled Black Money, until the Seishikai intimidated the publisher into not releasing it. Even without any ceremonial exchange of sake cups taking place, the Yakuza and Japan's top politicians were like sworn brothers going into the 1960s, ready to become bigger and more powerful than they had ever been, even before World War II. In December of 1963, Kodama sent a letter to all LDP members, in which he denounced the massive amounts of infighting going on inside the party at the time. In his opinion, the LDP would eventually lose its grip on Japanese politics if peace could not be achieved. Nothing particularly wrong or unusual about that letter so far, until one decides to check the signatures at the bottom. The bosses of 7 different Yakuza gangs, some of the most powerful in the country, signed the leaflet. Obviously a threat from Kodama, but certainly not an empty one. Yakuza gangs would generally not cooperate with each other, even though they mostly shared the same goals and ideals. But to Kodama, nothing seemed impossible at that point, and so he made an ambitious attempt to bring the most powerful gangs in Tokyo together into a coalition of Yakuza clans. Officially formed in 1963, this coalition was meant to not only intimidate LDP members who wouldn't fall in line, but also a certain Yakuza gang from Kobe in Japan's Kansai region, the Yamaguchi-gumi, which was and still is the biggest gang in the country to this day. If you're looking to find the single most defining crime organization in the history of the Yakuza, the Yamaguchi-gumi is probably what you're looking for. Unlike most Japanese crime syndicates, the Yamaguchi-gumi traces its roots all the way back to the early 20th century. Founded by Yamaguchi Harukichi in 1915, the Yamaguchi-gumi started off by supplying laborers to the local shipyards in Kobe. That way, the gang was able to grow quickly in number, and in 1925, Yamaguchi Harukichi's 23-year-old son Noboru succeeded his father and took over the family business. Noboru managed to take the Yamaguchi-gumi to new heights, not only expanding the family's port business, but also using its resources and manpower to enter the entertainment business. A common theme among Yakuza gangs decades later, but quite a revolutionary idea back in the 1920s. It was the gang's third boss, however, the aforementioned Taoka Kazuo, who really turned the Yamaguchi-gumi into the dominant force of the Japanese underworld. Taoka Kazuo, as his name implies, was not related to the Yamaguchi family. Instead, he worked his way up the organization's ranks the hard way, starting at the young age of 14, running errands, fighting, and murdering in the name of the Yamaguchi-gumi for 9 years, before even becoming a sworn member of the gang. His time to truly shine, though, came in the 1940s. Coming fresh off a prison sentence, Taoka returned to a Yamaguchi-gumi in 1943 that had been nearly decimated by the war. With only 25 members left, its founder and his successor both dead and its resources nearly depleted, the Yamaguchi-gumi was a shadow of its former self. Taoka Kazuo, though, took what was left and, just like Japan itself, started to rebuild after the war. He became the Oyabun, or boss, of the Yamaguchi-gumi in October of 1946, and over the following 3.5 decades turned the gang into the biggest, richest, and most feared crime organization that Japan had ever seen. When Taoka passed away in July of 1981, the Yamaguchi-gumi was making an estimated $460 million per year and boasted more than 10,000 members. More than enough to make even a guy like Kodama Yoshio cower in fear. Kodama's collaboration of Tokyo gangs in 1963 was a sort of warning to Taoka Kazuo not to interfere with their turf, aka the city of Tokyo. This attempt, however, ultimately failed, with Taoka eventually gaining a foothold in Tokyo and Yokohama anyway, while the coalition itself dissolved after only 15 months. We are talking about rival Yakuza gangs here after all. It could never work. This failure, however, was merely a little bump in the road for Kodama Yoshio. He was still the middleman between organized crime and Japanese politics, and well respected among even the most intimidating figures in Japan, including Taoka Kazuo. The amount of respect that Kodama demanded became evident on October 24, 1972, when again he managed to do the impossible, successfully negotiating a merger between a Yamaguchi-gumi and one of its fiercest rivals, the Inagawa Kai. Despite reaching such incredible heights, Kodama himself stated that his dream was to simply retire and go fishing. Whether or not he was actually serious, granted he was known to be an avid fisherman, one thing was very clear. Money, manpower, and powerful connections were all at his fingertips. Kodama had, without a doubt, become the most powerful man in Japan, until a scandal shook the foundation that his throne was built upon. Starting in 1976, Kodama became one of the main targets of an investigation regarding a massive bribery scandal. The biggest that Japan had ever seen, in fact. The Lockheed scandal, named after American arms and airplane manufacturer Lockheed, didn't just shake the land of the rising sun though. It shook the whole world, with countries like Germany, the Netherlands, and Italy all mixed up in a series of bribes that were supposed to aid Lockheed in getting their commercial airplane business off the ground. No pun intended. We are talking eye-watering sums here. Over the span of 20 years, an estimated $12.6 million in bribes were funneled into Japan alone, paying off multiple high-ranking government officials, including Prime Minister Tanaka Kakue. Around $7 million though, more than half of the bribes that reached Japan belonged to Kodama Yoshio, an absolute fortune even before you adjusted for inflation. The Lockheed scandal, being as massive as it was, received worldwide coverage, which represented a major problem for Kodama especially. The Japanese press, and even the police, had been well aware of his involvement with Lockheed since at least the 1960s. But usually, the press in Japan chose to stay away from reporting corruption scandals which were connected to the government. But with the whole world watching, all of that changed. Both the press, as well as investigators, were now well and truly on Kodama's ultra-nationalist ass. The police actually raided his house, looking through all of his personal files, hoping to find every bit of incriminating information that was contained in them. Raids like this were actually incredibly unusual in Japan at the time. Kodama's health also took a sharp turn for the worse around that time. While the press was hammering him in the media and his property was being raided, he suffered a stroke for the first time and was consequently confined to his bed. But even then, the pressure just kept on piling up, with protesters starting to gather in front of his house, some even attempting to break in. The only thing that stopped them was a mix of policemen and loyal Yakuza goons protecting the gates of Kodama's home in Tokyo's Setagaya ward. Even the ultra-nationalists, who were once not only loyal to Kodama, but even admired him, would send him notes telling him to end his own life for damaging the reputation of Japan. An unconfirmed rumor even stated that the Yamaguchi-gumi was planning an assassination attempt on Kodama. And while an attempt to take Kodama's life was certainly made, it did not come from the Yakuza. Maeno Mitsuyasu, a struggling adult film actor from Tokyo, as well as a huge admirer of Kodama and the ultranationalist movement, had become increasingly disappointed with his former hero who had now turned into Japan's public enemy number one. On March 23, 1976, Maeno, along with two of his friends, showed up at Tokyo's Chofu airport dressed up as a kamikaze pilot. Pretending to be a film crew, they requested to rent a plane in order to film a scene, which was promptly provided by the airport staff. Maeno put on a headband with the famous rising sun design on it, just like the ones that kamikaze pilots used to wear during World War II, and as he took off, shouted "Tenno Heika Banzai," long live the Emperor. Following takeoff, Maeno circled the airspace above Tokyo for about an hour, before telling his friends that he would fly to Setagaya ward to take care of some quote-unquote business. Maeno lowered the plane, approached Kodama's house, and proceeded to circle it twice while repeating the kamikaze battle cry over his radio before aiming his plane towards the house and crashing it into the veranda. Maeno passed away immediately on impact, but Kodama, like so many times in the past, got lucky. At the time of the attack, he was located in another part of the house, which was affected neither by the crash nor the fire that ignited the house as a result. Even after surviving such an insane attack on his life, Kodama's troubles were far from over. In June of 1977, accused of both tax evasion and violation of foreign exchange laws, Kodama made his first and last court appearance due to his declining health. But the prosecutors didn't let him off the hook, reportedly showing up at his home around 70 times to question the bedridden Kodama, while also seizing his property, assets, and his beloved collection of Asian art. A 3-year prison sentence given to Kodama in 1981 was never served. Instead, he spent the next 3 years seeing his own health decline further and further. Not only that, but he also lost most of his sources of income, many people who once claimed to be his friends, and with that most of his power and influence. On January 17, 1984, Kodama passed away after suffering yet another stroke. He was 72 years old. While he died as a shadow of his former self in terms of power, influence, and wealth, huge crowds of people came to mourn his passing over the span of several days, among them former business associates, ultranationalists, and even celebrities. While attending Kodama's funeral might have been a bit too risky for his former political contacts, his associates from the criminal underworld showed up in droves without a second thought, including Inagawa Kakuji, boss of the Inagawa Kai gang, who proudly proclaimed that, quote, "The world will never see the likes of Kodama Yoshio again." Indeed, while Kodama was now gone, his influence can still be felt to this day. Calling the LDP, which was largely his creation, the dominant party of post-war Japan would almost be an understatement. Except for 2 brief periods, once in the 90s and then again in the early 2010s, the Liberal Democratic Party has controlled the inner workings of the land of the rising sun continuously. His influence on the Japanese underworld was just as significant. Who knows if the Yakuza would have ever made it beyond the black market business if it wasn't for a man as shady, ruthless, and despicable as Kodama Yoshio. A man who had no qualms whatsoever about being the middleman who brought organized crime closer to Japanese politics than it had ever been before. On January 26, 1985, 4 black cars pull up in front of an apartment complex in Osaka's Suita City. In front of the building's elevator stood Takenaka Masahisa, 4th-generation leader of the Yamaguchi-gumi and official successor to Taoka Kazuo, along with 2 of his highest-ranking affiliated gang bosses. The men exited their cars and fired at Takenaka and his associates. One of them died immediately, while the other was brought to the hospital and also passed away a few hours later. Takenaka, as well, was rushed to the hospital, where several Yamaguchi-gumi members were present to offer blood donations. However, even after a 9-hour-long surgery, Takenaka Masahisa succumbed to his wounds and passed away. With one fell swoop, the top men of the Yamaguchi-gumi were taken out, and the deadliest gang war in Japanese history, the Yamaichi War, had begun. The furious Yamaguchi-gumi soon elected a temporary leader, Nakanishi Kazuo, who wasted no time in declaring war on the Ichiwakai, whose members carried out the attack. Over the following 12 months, a total of 200 armed attacks were recorded to have taken place between the two gangs. That same year, the Yamaguchi-gumi got involved in a gigantic arms stealing scandal, which would be reported even by American news outlets while becoming one of the biggest stories of the year in Japan. The gang was caught red-handed in Hawaii, where they attempted to buy a crazy amount of weapons, including rocket launchers, from what they thought were arms dealers, but were actually American undercover agents. The investigation saw the Yamaguchi-gumi with 2 of their highest-ranking members sent to prison in the US, while also costing them a ton of money. And of course, respect. Surprisingly, even though a videotape of the deal being agreed was shown in court, the Yamaguchi-gumi bosses were found not guilty. The jury suspected entrapment, but the Yakuza also told the court that there had been a big cultural misunderstanding of the Japanese language, and that they had only been in Hawaii to hire Michael Jackson for a gig. No, I'm not making this up. Despite all of the turmoil going on inside the Yamaguchi-gumi, the Ichiwakai was slowly but surely losing the war in Osaka. But the violence seemed to never find an end, until one incident disgusted even the ruthless Yamaguchi-gumi and its leadership. One of their ex-members who joined the Ichiwakai was found brutally killed near a cliff. But not just any cliff. They found him near Banzai Cliff. Here, in 1944, hundreds of civilians and soldiers, including women and children, jumped from the cliff and to their deaths in order to avoid being captured by American soldiers. With that, the Yamaguchi-gumi had enough and called for peace between them and the Ichiwakai. The war was over, but for the 38 people who lost their lives during the Yamaichi War, it was unfortunately too late. The Yamaguchi-gumi remained as strong as ever, while the Ichiwakai shrunk into something that barely resembled a small gang by 1989. That same year, after 4 years of temporary leadership by Nakanishi, the Yamaguchi-gumi elected their true 5th-generation boss, Watanabe Yoshinori, and with a violent gang war behind them and a new leader at the top, their membership numbers grew to a staggering 20,000 as they headed into the 90s. But the public, and more importantly the Japanese government, would not forget about the Yamaichi War that easily. You see, for decades, there was a sort of unwritten agreement between the Yakuza, the Japanese government, and law enforcement. The Yakuza were basically allowed to operate their businesses and have their little gang wars among each other, as long as the public was not involved in any of it. However, the 1980s were a turning point regarding this agreement. The Yamaichi War especially involved the Japanese public way more than what the aforementioned unwritten agreement had called for. And generally, as the Yakuza reached a noticeable peak in many ways during the 1980s, so did the violence. In 1991, Japan finally chose to address the Yakuza problem with the so-called Crime Countermeasures Act. With this new law, Yakuza gangs could now officially be designated as Boryokudan, or violent groups, if certain criteria were met. Boryokudan are subjected to certain legal measures and penalties, which are aimed mostly at illegal activities like the collection of protection fees as well as extortion, 2 very important sources of income for Yakuza groups. Additionally, it was now illegal to charge money or request the severing of a finger in order to let a member leave the gang, which was supposed to make quitting life as a criminal easier for those who decided to do so. This first set of laws was certainly a step in the right direction. For the first time in Japanese history, the Yakuza, who've been around for centuries at this point, were officially recognized as something outright negative and problematic to society. Still, these new laws brought with them numerous critics who felt that the penalties were much too weak. For example, the Yakuza's finances could still not be targeted directly, and their assets were still pretty much untouchable as well. But despite these flaws, both the media and the police were quick to claim a victory over the organized crime groups of Japan. There were countless headlines and reports made about droves of Yakuza members quitting and gangs disbanding. In reality, the impact of the new laws was not as significant as it may have seemed on the surface. Front companies were set up by the gangs, which then simply employed the affected members, actually making their activities even harder to track than before. In 1994, the total number of Yakuza members sat at around 80,000. About half of these members were estimated to be employed at these front companies, and actually committed more crimes than those who were officially part of the gang. As for the many gangs which were reported to have disbanded, almost all of them were small, insignificant crime families with little to no influence, which also further strengthened the bigger crime groups, the top three being the Yamaguchi-gumi, the Inagawa-kai, and the Sumiyoshi-kai. Before the new laws came into effect, they accounted for approximately 45% of all gang membership. Now, that number had jumped to an incredible 65%. The big gangs were well prepared, even before the new laws were implemented. The Yamaguchi-gumi, for example, handed out a handbook titled How to Evade the Law and sent out faxes to affiliated gangs telling them to prepare by setting up front companies. By the time that the new millennium was around the corner, the number of Yakuza members did actually not go down. More power was simply shifted to those who had already been at the top for years or even decades. By the year 2000, the Yamaguchi-gumi had reached a membership of around 34,000 and managed to stay afloat mainly thanks to its thriving construction business. While trying to save its struggling economy throughout the 1990s, Japan invested an astonishing $3.5 trillion into public works projects, an estimated 1 to 5% of that money going into Yakuza-related construction projects. The Yamaguchi-gumi, hugely involved in construction, surely raked in billions of these deals. In 2005, Watanabe, who had acted as the boss of the Yamaguchi-gumi for 16 years, decided to retire and passed the torch to Tsukasa Shinobu, who became the Yamaguchi-gumi's 6th and most recent boss, as of today. Compared to some of his predecessors, Tsukasa is known to keep a fairly low profile. Or as low of a profile as you can keep as the boss of what is still Japan's biggest crime syndicate. The total number of Yakuza members across all gangs is currently sitting at around 24,000, 8,000 of which belong to the Yamaguchi-gumi. Fairly recently, in 2015, a group of senior members inside the Yamaguchi-gumi had a serious dispute with their boss, questioning both his leadership and the overall organizational structure of the gang. Consequently, they took around 1,000 Yamaguchi-gumi members and formed a new clan under the name Kobe Yamaguchi-gumi. As of the making of this video, their disputes seem to be unresolved. The police, however, are keeping a close eye on the two rival gangs, in hopes of avoiding violent outbreaks like the ones that Japanese citizens had to deal with too many times in the past. Due to their secretive nature, it's hard to gauge how much influence the Yakuza actually still have these days. With membership numbers on a steep decline in recent years, one can only wonder what the future holds for organized crime in Japan. Overseas gangs in countries like Russia and Italy managed to retain most of their power by basically reinventing themselves. But the Yakuza, with a history that dates back more than 400 years and being so deeply rooted in history and tradition, seems to be somewhat reluctant to make that change. Will the Yakuza decline even further, or will they rise from their ashes as they already did more than 70 years ago? Only time will tell. What other Japanese crime-related topics would you like to see me cover? Let me know in the comments down below. As usual, a huge shout out goes to all my Patreon supporters listed here, including Busner, Bobby Wu, Javier Soravia, Capybara Chuck, Turom, Daniel Dees, White Gilden, Justin Down, Yoko the Space Whale, Steve Matsui, and Torian Gales. And of course, to all of you who decided to watch this massive video all the way to the end. Seriously. Thank you so much for watching. Sayonara.